The call came at 1:47 a.m. on October 3rd. I was just finishing up my shift when my phone rang with an unknown local number. Some drunk driver had run a red light and T-boned my parents' car while they were coming home from dinner. Dad had a severe head injury and multiple broken ribs. Mom had internal bleeding and a collapsed lung. Both were in critical condition. I threw some clothes in a bag and drove straight to the hospital where they'd been taken. It's about a 3-hour drive from my place, and I spent the whole time trying to process what was happening. I kept calling Danny, but it went straight to voicemail every time. When I got to the emergency room around 5 a.m., I immediately went to the nurse's station. Being a nurse myself, I knew how to navigate the system and get information. The charge nurse recognized my name from when I'd called during the drive and filled me in on their conditions. Dad was stable but sedated after surgery to relieve pressure on his brain. Mom was still in surgery for her internal injuries. I asked if my brother had been contacted, and she said they'd left multiple messages but hadn't heard back. I tried calling him again and finally got through around 6 a.m. He sounded groggy and annoyed when he answered. I told him what happened, and he said he'd be there as soon as possible. Danny didn't show up until almost 2 p.m. I'd been at the hospital for 9 hours, talking to doctors, handling paperwork, and basically managing everything alone. When he finally walked into the ICU waiting room, he looked like he'd just rolled out of bed. No apology for being late, no explanation for not answering his phone. I stood up to hug him, but he barely returned it. He seemed more irritated than worried. I started filling him in on what the doctors had told me about their conditions and treatment plans. He listened for maybe 2 minutes before cutting me off. He told me I was overcomplicating everything and that the doctors would handle it. I explained that someone needed to make decisions about their care and coordinate with the medical team. That's when he said something that stopped me cold. He told me that Mom always loved him more anyway, so he should be the one making decisions. Then he said I was nature's mistake and should probably just go back to my own life. The way he said it was so casual, like he was commenting on the weather. I just stared at him. Our parents were unconscious in the ICU, fighting for their lives, and he was talking about who Mom loved more. I asked him what the hell was wrong with him. He shrugged and said he was just being honest about the family dynamics. The worst part was how matter-of-fact he sounded. Like this was something he'd been thinking about for years and just decided to share. I realized I was seeing a side of my brother I'd never seen before. Or maybe I'd been too naive to notice it. I told him we needed to focus on Mom and Dad right now, not on whatever issues he had with me. He said fine, but made it clear he thought I was being dramatic. Then he asked if there was anywhere decent to get coffee in this place because he was exhausted. The next morning, I met Danny in the hospital cafeteria to discuss our parents' situation. They were both still critical, but stable. Dad had woken up briefly, but was very confused. Mom was still sedated, but her surgery had gone well. I'd spent most of the night researching their insurance coverage and making lists of what we needed to handle. Their bills were going to be enormous, and someone needed to coordinate with their insurance company and manage their finances while they recovered. Danny seemed more alert than the day before, but still weirdly detached from the gravity of the situation. I spread out all my notes and started explaining what needed to be done. We needed to contact their employer benefits departments, figure out their insurance coverage, pay their regular bills, and probably arrange for extended care once they were discharged. He listened for about 5 minutes before telling me I was overthinking everything. He said he'd handle all the financial and legal stuff himself. I asked how he planned to do that since we'd need access to their accounts and important documents. That's when he pulled out a folder from his briefcase. He said he'd been helping them with their finances for months, and they'd already given him power of attorney to make things easier. He showed me the documents, dated about 6 months earlier. I was shocked. I asked why they hadn't mentioned this to me, and why they felt they needed someone to have power of attorney in the first place. Danny said they were getting older and wanted to simplify things. He claimed they'd chosen him because he lived closer and had more business experience. The documents looked official, but something felt off. I asked to see them more closely, but he put them back in his folder and said I didn't need to worry about the details. He told me I could focus on the medical side of things since I was a nurse, and he'd handle everything else. I pressed him about why our parents hadn't discussed this with me at all. It seemed like a pretty big decision to make without involving both their children. Danny got defensive and said maybe they didn't think I needed to know every detail of their business. He started talking about how he'd been the one visiting them regularly and helping them navigate their retirement planning. He made it sound like I'd been absent from their lives, which wasn't true. I called them every week and visited when I could, but my work schedule made it harder to drop by casually. The conversation got heated when I suggested we should both be involved in major decisions. Danny said the power of attorney gave him the legal authority to handle everything and that my input wasn't required. He was technically right, but the whole situation felt wrong. I asked him to at least keep me informed about what was happening with their finances and care decisions. He agreed, but in a way that made it clear he considered it a favor, not an obligation. Then he said he had some calls to make and left me sitting there with all my useless research notes. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. The timing of the power of attorney, Danny's attitude, his refusal to let me see the documents properly. I decided I needed to do some investigating of my own. That afternoon, I drove to my parents' house to gather some insurance documents and personal items they might need. I had a spare key they'd given me years ago for emergencies. Danny had said he'd handle everything, but I wanted to at least grab their insurance cards and medication lists for the hospital. The house felt eerily quiet as I let myself in. I went straight to Dad's home office where they kept all their important papers. Everything was organized in filing cabinets and desk drawers, just like Dad had always maintained. I was looking through their insurance folder when I heard a car door slam outside. Through the window, I saw Danny's car in the driveway. He came through the front door and found me in the office. He demanded to know what I was doing there. I explained that I was just getting some documents the hospital might need. He told me he'd already handled all that, and I shouldn't be going through their personal files. I pointed out that these were our parents' documents, and I had every right to access them during a family emergency. Danny got increasingly agitated and started trying to physically block me from the filing cabinets. He said he had power of attorney, and I was overstepping my boundaries. I told him I wasn't trying to take over anything. I just wanted to help and understand what was going on. That's when I noticed something odd. There were bank statements scattered on Dad's desk that I hadn't seen before. The top one showed a large withdrawal from their savings account just 2 weeks earlier. I picked it up to look at it more closely. Danny immediately tried to grab it from me, but I'd already seen enough. It was a transfer for $15,000 to an account I didn't recognize. I asked him what this was about. He said our parents had asked him to help them move some money around for better interest rates. I kept looking through the statements while Danny got more and more agitated. There were multiple large transfers over the past several months, all to the same account. Some were for $10,000, others for $20,000. The pattern was clear and consistent. When I asked for the account information to verify these were legitimate transfers, Danny exploded. He said I was accusing him of stealing from our parents and that I had no right to question his financial management. He demanded I leave the house immediately. I refused to leave and told him these transfers needed to be explained. The amounts were too large and too frequent to be simple account management. I asked him to show me documentation proving these were authorized by our parents. Danny couldn't produce any documentation. Instead, he started threatening to have me arrested for trespassing and harassment. He said he'd call the police and tell them I was trying to steal from our unconscious parents. I realized I was looking at evidence of financial elder abuse. My brother had been systematically draining our parents' accounts for months, possibly longer. The power of attorney documents suddenly made sense. He'd needed legal access to move money without raising suspicion. I took photos of several bank statements with my phone before Danny could stop me. He tried to grab my phone, but I was already backing toward the door. I told him I was going to report this to the authorities and the hospital social worker. Danny followed me outside, yelling that I was destroying the family over nothing. He claimed everything he'd done was legal and authorized. But his panic and anger told a different story. I drove away with my hands shaking, finally understanding the scope of what my brother had been doing. 2 days later, I requested a meeting with the hospital social worker to discuss my concerns about my parents' financial situation. I'd spent the previous day documenting everything I'd discovered and researching elder abuse reporting procedures. The social worker, Janet, met with me in a small conference room near the ICU. I showed her the photos I'd taken of the bank statements and explained my brother's suspicious behavior. She listened carefully and took notes as I described the pattern of large withdrawals and transfers. Janet said she'd seen similar situations before and that my concerns were valid. She explained that hospitals were required to investigate potential elder abuse cases, especially when patients were vulnerable and unable to protect themselves. About halfway through our meeting, Danny showed up. He'd apparently heard from the nurses that I was meeting with social services and was furious. He barged into the conference room and demanded to know what lies I was telling about him. Janet calmly introduced herself and asked Danny to sit down. She explained that they were reviewing my parents' care needs and wanted to understand their financial situation to ensure proper discharge planning. Danny immediately went into damage control mode. He said I was jealous of his relationship with our parents and was making up stories to cause trouble. He claimed all the financial transactions were completely legitimate and authorized. Janet asked to see the power of attorney documents. Danny reluctantly produced them from his briefcase. While he was explaining how our parents had asked him to help manage their money, Janet was examining the papers carefully. After a few minutes, Janet pointed out some inconsistencies in the documents. The signatures didn't match other samples she'd seen in their medical records. The notary information seemed irregular. She said she'd need to have the documents verified by the hospital's legal department. Danny's demeanor changed completely. He started sweating and stumbling over his words. He threatened to remove our parents from this hospital and take them somewhere else where the staff minded their own business. That threat was a huge mistake. Janet explained that threatening to move critical patients for non-medical reasons was a red flag for abuse. She said she was now required to involve adult protective services and potentially law enforcement. Danny panicked and started begging her not to escalate the situation. He claimed he was under tremendous stress and hadn't meant to threaten anyone. He said he just wanted what was best for our parents. Janet remained professional but firm. She said an investigation was now mandatory given the suspicious financial activity and Danny's threats. She asked us both to provide contact information for the investigators. As we left the meeting, Danny grabbed my arm and hissed that I destroyed our family over nothing. He said our parents would never forgive me for causing this drama while they were fighting for their lives. But I knew I'd done the right thing. Our parents deserved protection, even if it meant exposing my brother's crimes. Janet had validated my concerns and was taking action to safeguard their interests. 3 weeks later, I met with the lawyer handling my parents' case at his downtown office. Mom and Dad were both awake and recovering, though they still had a long road ahead. The investigation into Danny's financial activities had uncovered far more than I'd initially suspected. The lawyer, Mr. Peterson, had been appointed by the court to represent my parents' interests during the investigation. He'd been working with Adult Protective Services and the district attorney's office to build a case against Danny. Mr. Peterson spread out a thick folder of documents on his conference table. He explained that forensic accountants had traced the suspicious transactions I'd discovered and found a pattern going back over 2 years. The total amount stolen was staggering. Danny had been systematically transferring money from our parents' accounts to his own personal accounts. He'd started small, maybe $2,000 or $3,000 at a time. But as he got more confident, the amounts increased dramatically. In the months before the accident, he was taking $15,000 to $20,000 monthly. The power of attorney documents were indeed forged. Mr. Peterson showed me the analysis comparing the signatures to authentic samples. Danny had apparently practiced forging our parents' signatures and had used a fake notary stamp he'd purchased online. The total theft exceeded $200,000. Money that was supposed to fund our parents' retirement and potential long-term care needs. Danny had used it to pay off his credit cards, make his mortgage payments, and fund what appeared to be a pretty expensive lifestyle. Mr. Peterson said the evidence was overwhelming and that criminal charges were inevitable. Danny would likely face multiple felony counts including elder abuse, forgery, and grand theft. The district attorney was pushing for significant prison time given the amount involved and the vulnerability of the victims. About an hour into our meeting, Danny arrived with his own lawyer. He'd been trying to negotiate some kind of plea deal to avoid prison time. His attorney had requested this meeting to see if we could work something out privately. Danny looked terrible. He'd lost weight and seemed to have aged years in just a few weeks. When he saw me, he immediately started crying and begging for forgiveness. He claimed he'd been under financial pressure and had only meant to borrow the money temporarily. His story kept changing as he talked. First it was a loan, then it was money our parents had given him, then it was compensation for helping them with their finances. His own lawyer looked embarrassed by the contradictions. Mr. Peterson cut through the nonsense and laid out the facts. Danny had stolen over $200,000 from elderly parents who trusted him. He'd forged legal documents and lied to family members and authorities. There was no scenario where this could be characterized as a misunderstanding or temporary borrowing. Danny's lawyer tried to argue that his client was willing to make full restitution and that prison time wouldn't serve anyone's interests. Mr. Peterson pointed out that Danny had already spent most of the money and had no realistic way to pay it back quickly. The meeting ended with no resolution. Danny left still crying and begging me to convince our parents not to press charges. But the decision was out of our hands now. The state was pursuing criminal charges regardless of what our family wanted. Epilogue asterisk. That was 8 months ago. Danny pleaded guilty to elder abuse and theft charges and was sentenced to 4 years in prison. He'll probably serve about 2.5 years with good behavior. He was also ordered to pay full restitution, though we'll probably never see most of that money. My parents are doing much better physically. Dad still has some cognitive issues from his brain injury, but he's functioning well. Mom made a full recovery from her internal injuries. They're both devastated by what Danny did, but they're trying to move forward. The hardest part for them isn't even the money, though that's been a real problem. It's the betrayal by their son and the realization that his increased attention over the past few years was just him setting up his theft operation. Mom keeps saying she should have known something was wrong. I've been much more involved in their lives since the accident. I moved closer to them and help manage their finances now, with proper legal documentation and transparency. We've had to make some adjustments to their retirement plans because of the stolen money, but they'll be okay. As for Danny and me, we don't have a relationship anymore. He's written me letters from prison trying to explain himself and asking for forgiveness. I haven't responded. Maybe someday I'll be able to forgive him, but I'll never trust him again. The whole experience taught me that you never really know someone completely, even family members you've known your whole life. Danny showed his true character when our parents were most vulnerable, and it wasn't pretty. But at least now they're protected from him, and that's what matters most.